An alien from the Andromeda Galaxy suddenly arrives on Earth. It was nothing like the other aliens. What was its purpose? Why did it come to Earth? Before we find out everything, please subscribe. Now let's begin the story. At the very beginning of the story, we see a dog named Paul in a quiet house in the year 1947. The dog starts barking as it notices an intense light outside. Shortly after, a little girl comes out of the house and lets the dog go outside. But within moments, the entire area is illuminated by a bright light. By then, the little girl had also come outside, and at that very moment, a strange object attacks them. The scene then shifts to the present day, where two friends, Clive and Robert, leave England for a grand road trip across America. Along the way, they enjoy a massive fair. Anyway, that night, we learn that these two friends actually want to visit the mysterious place called Area 51 Inches in America. According to their plan, they set off the next day once again. While having fun on the road, they reach the front of Area 51 and take several pictures. Later, they stop at a coffee shop. After spending some time there, they resume their journey, but they accidentally get into a minor accident with another car. In a panic, they quickly flee from the scene. As they continue their journey, they arrive at the quietest spot on the highway next to Area 51. They took a few more pictures there, but suddenly they noticed a car speeding towards them from behind. Seeing this, both of them were terrified, thinking that the people involved in the accident in front of the coffee shop might be following them to harm them. So, they quickly drove away in their minibus. At one point, when the car behind them got closer, they realized that it was actually a different car. They felt a bit relieved, but just then, the other car met with a horrific accident. Slowly, the two friends approached the crashed vehicle and found that no one was inside. Still, they were about to call the emergency number when suddenly, someone from behind said, "If I were you, I wouldn't call the emergency number." Terrified, they turned around and saw a strange-looking alien slowly emerging from the darkness. Upon seeing it, Clive immediately fainted. However, through Robert's conversation with the alien, we come to know that this was the same alien that had appeared before the little girl in 1947. The alien introduced itself, saying, "My name is Paul. I'm in great danger here on this road. Please help me, or I will die right here." Despite being shocked, Robert had no other choice but to take Paul with him. They lifted Clive into the van with Paul's help. As Robert drove, he and Paul started talking, and soon Robert became quite comfortable with him. Meanwhile, a man approached the crashed vehicle. He then called a woman and said, "Don't worry, madam. The tire marks here suggest that the alien has escaped in a civilian's car. Once I catch him, I'll kill a few civilians, label it an accident, and clear everything up." The man's name was Jewel, and hearing his words, his boss seemed pleased. Following his instructions, a group of police officers started preparing to set up roadblocks on the highway. On the other hand, the two friends continued driving down the highway. At one point, when Clive regained consciousness and saw Paul inside the vehicle, he immediately grabbed the alien's throat, trying to strangle him. But Robert explained to him, "This alien is really kind and friendly. Calm down." Although Clive was still tense, he gradually calmed down. Just then, they noticed a police checkpoint ahead. Paul quickly vanished from sight. The police thoroughly searched their vehicle but found nothing and let them go. However, as soon as they left the checkpoint, Paul reappeared inside the van. Shocked, both friends asked, "How did you disappear?" Paul replied, "I can disappear whenever I want, but only for as long as I can hold my breath." Robert had already bonded well with Paul, but Clive was still reluctant to accept him. He tried to convince Robert that keeping such a strange creature with them would ruin their lives. Clive said, "If the police catch us, there's no telling how many eggs they'll smash on our heads." Robert reassured him, saying, "Look, buddy, this little alien came from a small planet in the Andromeda Galaxy just to explore Earth. He got stuck here, and humans have been experimenting on him for the past 40 years. Now, he's pleading with us to save his life. How can we abandon him?" Hearing all this, Clive calmed down a little. As they continued their journey, morning arrived. Meanwhile, Jewel went to the police officers and asked if they had found anything after checking any cars. The police said they hadn't found much, just two boys from England traveling across America. However, they mentioned that there was a strange smell coming from their bus. Hearing this, Jewel immediately ordered them to look for that vehicle again. On the other hand, the two friends, along with Paul, arrived at a gas station. While they were refueling their vehicle, a police officer suddenly showed up. Clive panicked, and Robert, who was shopping inside, also got scared upon seeing the police. However, somehow, they managed the situation and returned to their vehicle. As they were chatting and moving forward, a bird suddenly collided with their bus and died on the spot. Paul picked up the dead bird and, in a strange way, brought it back to life. Everyone thanked him, but moments later, Paul ate the bird. The two friends were shocked by Paul's actions, but continued their journey nonetheless. Meanwhile, the police officer and Agent Jewel were tracking them and eventually reached the same gas station. By evening, the two friends, along with Paul, reached a hotel where they planned to park their vehicle. They talked to a girl named Ruth, who offered them overnight parking for just $25. Upon seeing Ruth, Robert immediately developed a crush on her. Anyway, they had to leave their passports with Ruth for the night to stay at the hotel. Later that night, Clive asked Paul, "Why did you come here?" Paul replied, "I actually came here for scientific research. Unfortunately, our spacecraft crashed, and for a few days, a girl kept me safe. But later, some people captured me and took me to Area 51. They wanted to take my invisibility power by experimenting on my body, extracting my DNA and bone marrow." However, Paul was a very chill alien. Forgetting all his hardships, the three of them started having fun and even partied. After the party, they all fell asleep. The next morning, before they could wake up, Ruth knocked on their door. The two friends went to answer the door, but Paul quickly hid in the bathroom. Robert started flirting with Ruth, but suddenly, a loud gas noise came from the bathroom. Ruth was surprised and asked, "Who is in there with you?" She tried to open the bathroom door forcefully, and as soon as she did, Paul appeared in front of her. Poor Ruth fainted on the spot. Fearing that Ruth might report them to the police, they decided to take her with them. They made Paul invisible and sent him to Ruth's room to retrieve their passports. Paul managed to find the passports, but just then, Ruth's father spotted him. Somehow, Paul grabbed the passports and ran back. Ruth's father tried to shoot them, but luckily they managed to escape unharmed. After driving a long distance, Ruth regained consciousness. As soon as she saw Paul, she became extremely frightened and started reciting prayers loudly, thinking that Paul was a demon. Despite Robert's efforts to calm her down, Ruth kept screaming and praying loudly. Seeing this, Paul placed his hand on her head and transferred all his knowledge into her mind. As a result, Ruth no longer saw him as a demon, but recognized him as an alien. After this incident, Ruth fainted again. Seeing this, Robert jokingly said, "I want some cosmic knowledge too. Put your hand on my head." As expected, Paul transferred some knowledge into him as well. Meanwhile, the police officer and Agent Jewel arrived at Ruth's house. They interrogated her father and found out everything. During their search, they discovered a picture of Paul. However, after the search, Agent Jewel dismissed the police from the case. Later, while reporting to his superior via radio, Jewel mentioned that they were close to capturing the alien and that they would now have to kill not only the two boys, but also the girl with them. Ruth's father, who was inside the house, overheard everything through the radio. Determined to save his daughter, he grabbed his gun and set out. Meanwhile, Paul sincerely thanked Ruth for helping to save his life. He said, "I want to give you a gift in return. I know you have an issue with one of your eyes. Trust me, I can heal it." As promised, Paul placed his hand on Ruth's head and gradually healed her eye completely. Ruth was overjoyed. They all resumed their journey together. As night fell, they stopped at a club to eat. In front of the club, they spotted the same car that Clive had crashed into at the beginning of the movie. Ruth, hiding from her friends, called her father to inform him that she was safe. However, Agent Jewel intercepted the call and answered it instead. Jewel said, "Listen, Ruth, the people you are with are very dangerous. Tell us where you are. Your father is very worried about you. We want to take you back to him safely." But Ruth, without revealing anything, hung up the phone. By then, they had already tracked her location. Frightened, Ruth tried to escape, but she encountered the same two men whose car Clive and Robert had crashed earlier. The men started harassing Ruth in different ways, but by now she had become much braver. She fought back and managed to escape, running back to Clive and Robert. However, the two men followed her, even angrier now because they recognized Clive and Robert as the ones who had damaged their car. A fight broke out between them, which soon turned into a brawl involving everyone in the club. In the midst of the chaos, Ruth saw that her father had also arrived at the club. But before she could talk to him, someone attacked her father, knocking him unconscious. Seeing this, Ruth fled the scene, leaving her father behind, while the two men continued to chase after them. Finally, when Paul stepped out of the car, the two men saw him and immediately fainted from shock. However, by then, the police had arrived close by, and hearing the sirens, they quickly fled the scene. At one point, after reaching a safe place, they started discussing what they should do next. After a long conversation, they concluded that there was nothing they could do. So they all lit a fire, sat around it, and started sharing stories. They talked all night and eventually fell asleep right there. The next morning when they woke up, they realized they were very close to the city. To hide Paul from the townspeople, they disguised him as a cowboy and started walking through the city. But suddenly, they encountered Ruth's father. Paul quickly turned invisible and somehow managed to escape from him. Meanwhile, Robert left Paul with Clive and went to find Ruth. On the other hand, Agent Jewel approached Ruth, showing her a picture and asking, "Have you seen any of these people?" Since Ruth's one eye had previously been blind but was now healed, Jewel couldn't recognize her. Ruth replied, "No, I haven't seen anyone like that." After the agent left, Robert arrived, and Ruth told him everything. Meanwhile, inside a store, Paul was roaming around with Clive. Just then, a police officer entered the shop. Paul immediately stood still like a statue. The officer initially mistook him for a mannequin, but as he was about to leave, he hesitated and touched Paul. Upon being touched, Paul screamed loudly. Hearing Paul's scream, the terrified police officer ran away. However, another officer soon arrived and, seeing Paul, started shooting at him. Clive quickly took Paul and escaped from there. At this point, the police and Ruth's father spotted them and started chasing them. Running away, they finally reached the house where the spaceship had crashed 60 years ago. The little girl from that time was now an old woman. When they entered her house, she became emotional upon seeing Paul. She said, "You know, after the spaceship crash, I brought you into my house and took care of you. But when people took you away, nobody believed me when I told them about you. Everyone called me crazy. Not only that, but those agency people even locked me up in a mental asylum for many years. My life was ruined after meeting you, but still, seeing you after all these years makes me happy." As they were talking, the police raided the house. They fought back in different ways to defend themselves. Eventually, they managed to defeat the agent and escape from the house. Just then, Ruth's father arrived. But before anyone could stop them, they grabbed Paul and ran away. However, during their escape, there was a gas leak inside the house, which caused a massive explosion, destroying everything. Taking advantage of the explosion, they quickly drove away from the scene. Meanwhile, one police officer was killed in the explosion, and another one continued chasing them in his car. Ruth's father also followed them. Unfortunately, Agent Jewel had no vehicle, so the entire responsibility of catching the alien now fell on the remaining police officer. Anyway, the chase continued. At one point, the police officer pursuing them also died in an accident. However, Agent Jewel and Ruth's father were still on their trail, but Jewel shot at Ruth's father and forced him off the road. Meanwhile, Robert, Clive, Ruth, and Tara took Paul deep into the jungle, where they discovered a huge mountain. They all started heading toward the mountain. On the other hand, Agent Jewel also reached close to the mountain. Paul tried to signal their spaceships in space by launching fireworks. Meanwhile, Jewel, loading a large gun with extra bullets, began searching for them. The group waited at the foot of the mountain, hoping their spaceship would come to rescue them. Just then, they saw green lights in the sky. They were overjoyed, but soon realized that it was actually a helicopter. The woman who had been instructing Jewel via radio had arrived in the helicopter. She immediately tried to take Paul with her. At that moment, Jewel appeared from behind and shot at Paul, but the bullet hit one of the madam's bodyguards instead. This led to a shootout between them. Jewel managed to kill the two bodyguards, but the madam shot Jewel, injuring him. As the madam tried to capture Paul, his friends stood in her way, but she fought them off one by one, determined to take Paul. Finally, they managed to knock her unconscious with a punch. At this point, it was revealed that Jewel had actually come to save Paul because, during the fight at the house earlier, Paul had brainwashed Jewel into becoming a good person. Everything seemed to be going well, but suddenly Ruth's father arrived and shot at Paul. Unfortunately, the bullet hit Robert in the chest instead. In his final moments, Robert's condition worsened, and within seconds, he died. Everyone started crying uncontrollably, but Paul used his extraordinary powers and desperately tried to revive Robert. He placed his hand over Robert's chest wound, and eventually, Robert was healed. However, a bullet wound appeared on Paul's chest, and he collapsed, seemingly dead. Everyone mourned for Paul, but after a moment, he suddenly came back to life. It turned out that after performing such a powerful act, Paul had only temporarily weakened, but was actually fine. Just when everything seemed to be back to normal, the madam once again pointed a gun at them. At that moment, the spaceship's door opened right above her, crashing down and knocking her unconscious. Paul's people had finally arrived to take him back home. Paul bid farewell to everyone, but before leaving, he approached Tara and said, "Your life has been ruined because of me, hasn't it? You have no one left on this planet." "I know. Do you want to come with me?" Tara, with tears in her eyes, replied, "Yes, of course." As a result, Paul took Tara with him, said goodbye to Robert and Clive, and left Earth to return to his own world. And with that, today's story comes to an end.